Presented by our dear guest, Kaiya Sиглик. She's leading cybersecurity strategist at very respectful and well-known company, Microsoft. So I hope you enjoy this talk, and I'm giving the word to Kaiya.
Do I need to hold it all the time? I'll try. I'll try to remember. Hi, I'm Kaiya, and I kind of want you to come closer, pardon me, because some of you are very far. And I also want to make sure that we actually have this as an interactive conversation. So feel free to interrupt me with questions. I'll sort of stop every so often and force you to ask questions. But so thank you for having me here. What we're going to talk today will be both. Hello? Okay, this works. This works. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm not terribly technology literate. And so what I thought we talk about today is the concept of cybersecurity norms, which is sort of the rules of the road managing state behavior in cyberspace. So in the presentation, we'll go through some of the reasons why it'd be good to have norms, but look at the definitions and also sort of look at some of the challenges and ways forward that Microsoft, but also other companies have been thinking about and sort of presenting to governments around the world. Moved. So one thing I would say to start out of is the evidence of state behavior in cyberspace is really growing. This is a few headlines that I pulled for literally the last month. I went into Google search and I basically put in cyber war. That is becoming increasingly a worrying thing for private companies, because a lot of times we're sort of in the middle of it, right? When governments decide to attack other governments or other industries in sort of a different country, a lot of times they would use the Windows platform, for example, or they would use Apple or something like that. And no matter what happens or what their particular objective is, oftentimes that means that they create a vulnerability in a product or they exploit an existing vulnerability in a product, which opens up that creates a threat for all other customers all around the world, not just the particular objective that they might want to have achieved. And this sort of comes at a time where the sort of online activity is increasing. I think in the next few years we'll see, and I'll go through it with these slides, but in the next few years we'll see 90% plus of the population in sort of the Western world online, about 70% probably of the population in emerging markets online. And sort of these slides sort of behind me and around demonstrate how the environment has changed and how the players in cybersecurity have changed with the time and how we're thinking they will actually change further. This slide in particular is a slide of the world in 2005. And 2005 is basically, it's when I finished school. But it's also the world where Facebook only really first started to come out of like the 3 or 4 main colleges that we're in. Google Maps didn't exist yet. So it was iPhone only came out, I think 2007, the first one, or 2008. So it's a very, very different world. We had about 1 billion people online. And as you can see, the majority were, and I will explain why you can see this, were in sort of the bits with the biggest bubbles. So the bigger the square you see on the screen, the more people they have online. So the US has about 200 million people online at this stage, followed by China, but China only has about 100 million, and Japan, very close afterwards, has about 83 million. Other thing that you need to think about is also how dark the bubble is. So the darker the bubble, the greater percentage online. So that's the reason why the Chinese are so light. They only have about 10% of the population online, not even that. So the bubbles will really change, and they have. 2015, so more or less today, last year, the overview of the landscape changed dramatically. As you can see, China has now dramatically overtaken everybody else. And it has so it's grown in 10 years by about 600 million people in terms of internet penetration. The US, on the other hand, has also grown, but it's only grown about 60 million. And it really doesn't have anywhere to go. So you see that there's clearly a shift towards sort of, is on this side? No, on this side, for you, sorry. Towards the sort of Southeast Asia space in terms of big players online. You also see the other sort of big players that you might not normally think about are countries like Nigeria, which at this stage has almost as many people online as Russia, which I also don't think most people are like, no one thinks about Africa and how big the countries are. At least I don't. I think then you have Egypt is also fairly big, Iran, Turkey. They're all countries that are in the next probably 10 years going to overtake the vast majority of Western Europe in particular, but also will also try to probably play a much more active role in cyberspace. In addition to sort of the increasing number of people online, we obviously also see a lot more devices online. So this is not something that the image shows, but I think it's something that you should think about because it vastly increases the space for attack. I think estimates are anywhere between 25 to 50 billion of devices online in the next, I think it's 2-3 years now, by 2020. And that's billion with a B. And at the same time, most of these devices are completely not protected and not secure. Even if security vendors still have a lot of challenges in this space, they have over time really invested in security and started to develop security by sort of products with and services by security by design, tried to limit and have limited the number of vulnerabilities in the products, established relationships with security researchers that report vulnerabilities and fix them, and also begun to sort of have established processes for patching and things like that. The vast majority of products in the IoT space are completely designed without security in mind. Even if they are, it's sort of as an afterthought. It is still a very emerging market. It's one of those things where actually being first to the market is a lot more important than anything else, because someone else might have the same idea and start selling it before you. And it doesn't matter if your product is like 10 times more secure, probably means it's 10 times more expensive. At the beginning, you really just need to be first to be able to grab the share. HP did Hewlett-Packard did some research a few years back, and they looked at, I think, the 10 most popular devices on the market. This was maybe 2 years back. And they discovered that 70% of them had some sort of vulnerability, security vulnerability on them. And the vast majority had on average about 25 that couldn't be patched, that couldn't be fixed. They were just there. So that's kind of like a scary part of cyberspace as well as we go into the future. So that's sort of 2025. As you see, the map has really, really changed from where we were, I guess, 20 years ago. We have today 3.6 billion online. This is probably about 5 billion people online. If we think back to 2005, when it was just 1 billion, Facebook alone has 1 billion users. Microsoft has 1 billion users today. And in this world, it'll be dramatically different. And it's also likely that countries that traditionally have not played large roles in cyberspace will want to do more. Because they will be like, I have the third biggest internet population online. I should perhaps have a greater say than, for example, Germany. That's just an example. I think from here you'll see Indonesia really growing, Philippines really growing, Pakistan again really growing. So, and then Brazil in South America. So I think as we go forward, think about this market not just as sort of emerging, but I think as strong players in cyberspace, both in terms of economic opportunity, but in terms of strong regulators and actors in the international sphere. The other thing that will be, I think, interesting is and that's sort of what happened in the past 10 years is the speed of innovation. But like I said earlier, 2005 was a completely different world. No one, I think, would have imagined the power that cloud computing has brought forward and how it's transformed how companies do business, how we can use its technology to drive artificial intelligence, to drive insights from big data, whether it's in research, trying to figure out how to cure diseases, whether it's in developing self-driving cars. I think that means if we look back and see in 2016, we'd never have predicted this in 2005. I think looking forward 10 years is even more difficult. I think it'll be an exciting time. There'll be very different new products on the market, new services on the market. It'll be very disruptive as well. I think if you think about how already technology is affecting the traditional jobs market, if you think about Uber or if you think about Airbnb, which sort of don't have, besides a small group, traditional employees, the change in the next few years will be really, really transformative and dramatic. And I think that is significantly driving insecurity in cyberspace on behalf of the governments. I will stop here. If anyone has questions of this overview before I go into the...
Yes, please.
Can you expand on, you've just mentioned that the impact can be disruptive, and you actually mentioned only traditional job places. Will that be the only area?
No, for sure. I think there'll be other things as well. I think it's whether you think about whether it's security or whether you think about how we think about privacy. I think that's not even, it's not just a question of for sort of the technology companies itself. I think we are all looking to see how we can utilize data. I think that's clearly what we're trying to do. But it's also, like what I said earlier, in terms of cancer research, for example, how do we figure out what the right framework is where we know we can actually advance research if we use data, or the healthcare data from humans to...
Well, in the case of cancer, that it's not disruptive as...
Well, it is. I mean, it kind of is, because it's my data. And it's sort of, but if a private insurance company has it, or even a national insurance has it, and gives it to Microsoft or to Google to do research on cancer without asking me, you know, like, what is that model that emerges where we go and sort of give the right ownership to a human in terms of what you want to do with the data? Do you want to contribute it? And sort of for basically, I think sometimes a great purpose, which is sort of healthcare research. But sometimes that same great purpose might have a commercial component in it. You know, there will be a drug that sort of emerges at the end of it, and like a Pfizer sells it. And do I get paid from it? Do I just volunteer for it? You know, I think there are all really challenging questions. I think when I said earlier, the other one is artificial intelligence. I think the concept of ethics in this space in particular, I think there's one example that people tend to use is where, you know, a self-driving car would drive, and you would see like there will be an accident. And it would normally, and there's a bus and a car. And if it hits the bus, it will hurt the people on the bus, but like the person in the car will survive. But if it hits like a rock, or like it turns around and hits a wall, the person in the car dies, but you save the people on the bus. And when they do experiments with humans always hit the bus, right? But the artificial intelligence probably wouldn't, because it would make a calculation what is the least damage, and it will kill you, right? The person in the car. So things like that, and figuring out how to monitor that, how to establish effective frameworks for that, I think are all things that governments will really, and I think governments and industry together, but governments in particular, will really have to sort of struggle with the next few years. I think the other bit is, and we'll talk about this like in more detail here, but we'll talk about cyber warfare here, but it's also the legislative frameworks overall. I think there's a great deal of opportunity out there, but governments are putting frameworks together without really talking to each other a lot of times, or learning from each other, or figuring out how to enable and how to protect in a way that's actually effective, right? Everyone's doing their own thing. And I think that's challenging, not just for the industry, but for like the IT industry, but overall. And I know like on data protection in particular, there's very different cultural values, right? I think if I'm Slovenian, and for me, privacy is kind of important. If I talk to my colleagues in Asia, they're like, I don't care. And it's also a generational issue, right? I think if there's people who are like 50 or older, are much more protective of the data than people who are the millennial generation, who are much more like, oh, but then I get stuff for free, it's fine, right? So I think figuring out both sort of the generational things, the cultural things, and actually figuring out how in a world where it's a very global environment, you kind of need to work with each other globally, I think will also be important. I hope that sort of answers your question. Sort of. Anything more? Or I'll go into norms. So this slide talks about the different roles of governments in cyberspace. I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, I think a lot of times private companies are like, oh, they just put rules on us and it's terrible. But it's actually important to acknowledge that governments have very specific roles in cyberspace, and they're there for a reason. I think the first one here is they're protectors. So they are they actually have a duty to protect their citizenship, including in cyberspace. They are users. pretty much like any other organizations, governments use technology to give their citizens services. They're also creators, like I said, creators of laws, of regulations that seek to manage this new environment and seek to protect citizens with it. I think at the moment we see them a lot of initiatives in particularly in protecting sort of the broader systems, so like the government systems or critical infrastructure systems, I think here as well. And we see a lot of them in sort of trying to protect society, which is sort of looking at things like child online safety and sort of data protection initiatives. They're also exploiter. I think often for legitimate national security purposes, but often not. And we see them sort of act both in sort of the below warfare activities, which is sort of military, economic espionage, which is largely activities that countries have always done. They just now do it online. Or they sort of support, some countries support sort of their proxies in targeting companies for exploitation of intellectual property. And then others sort of engage in more sort of overarching surveillance activities across borders, which is also something that happens. And on the deck up there, you see the level of activity is actually very high. At the moment, around 90 countries are sort of passing some sort of law, regulation, or activity in cyberspace. There's more than 70 that sort of adopted cybersecurity strategies. I think here, we just this week or thing signed the cybersecurity doctrine, or I think at some point this week or last week. And then there's a lot more countries in this space which have defensive and offensive capabilities. I think in terms of defensive capabilities, here it's more than 50, but that sort of announced them and made them public. But in reality, more and more countries are investing in military cybersecurity, but for defensive purposes. We also have over 40 countries with declared offensive capabilities, which is the bit that's kind of scary. You know, traditionally sort of investing in cyber weapons. Traditionally, this is sort of a space where you'd probably have 4 or 5 big players. You'd have the US, you have Russia, you have China, you'll probably have Iran, and you have the UK. I think those are probably, you know, the strongest, the most developed countries in this space. But now, no, you do, yeah, those are, I think, the 5 top ones.
Can you repeat once more?
Which ones? So the US, China, Russia, Iran, and the UK are. I did not in terms of order, but like top 5. But and a lot of it is estimation, right? We don't know what cyber weapons they have. We just estimate because it's not public information. We can see attacks. We can see, for instance, the US like makes public. They're like, we invest $9 billion again with the B in cyber stuff every year. Some of it is on offensive, some of it's in defensive. We just know it's a really large number, right? I think but now also it's getting a much more crowded space. Denmark decided to invest in it, and I was like, Denmark, this is strange, right? Also this summer, Zimbabwe had started to buying cyber weapons, and it's one of those things where you're like, but you don't have anything. You don't have any regulatory structure. You don't have any defensive structure, but they're like, oh, we want a weapon, right? And that's kind of where the insecurity in cyberspace is increasing and getting, and sort of really worrying people. I think predominantly because, let me see, what's the next slide? Okay, predominantly because it's also very different from traditional military operations. Traditional military operations, you can be very targeted. You can be like, I'm gonna attack this particular area, I'll drop a bomb, right? In cyber space, it's very difficult to control and to target what you want to achieve, right? You can try and you can sort of be like, you can get into a network and sort of just sit there. But even like, sort of give Stuxnet as an example, which is obviously an example that everyone knows, but the concept of that they found sort of the virus pretty much everywhere on the planet, even though it was targeted just for a particular operation in Iran. I think they found it on the space station like 2 years ago. You know, like it's clear that it can just spread because it's all interconnected, and a lot of systems that people use are the same. And I think, you know, in case of Stuxnet, again, to give an example why private sector companies are so terrified of this. So for us in particular, that was, they used 4 zero-day vulnerabilities. So the zero-day vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities in software that they are basically being exploited. So there's 0 days until exploitation. And so you need to fix them immediately, basically. And for a large corporation, which again has a lot of software code, and if you change something, you might mess up something else, that's very difficult to do, right? Normally, I think our deadlines are like 90 days. So they fixed it in, I think, 4. But and there were 4. It was one of those things and everybody was exposed. It wasn't just the particular Iranian nuclear power plant was exposed. Everyone on the Windows system could be attacked, right? I think that's the bit where we're like, that's not great. So that's why we sort of have been arguing for the concept of cybersecurity norms, which I'll give some legal definitions here, but the reason why is if you look at the curve behind me, yeah, on this side, I think there's general agreement that existing like law of armed conflict, law of countermeasures, and sort of applies when it comes to cyber war. But we haven't ever seen, like there hasn't been a declaration. It's never really gone that far, you know, like no one's died, fine information has been stolen and stuff like that, or information has been exposed, but no one's actually declared war, right? So we think that when it comes to war, there'll be proper rules of behavior, which hopefully countries will sort of apply. But in the world that we're now, which is this world of the light blue, which is stuff happens and it's not great, you know, and whether it's allegedly North Korea attacking South Korea this week, their cyber command center, or whether it's the espionage stuff that sort of every so often a government somewhere will discover American software on the system, or like any of these things. There's no rules of behavior that countries actually apply to it. So. Yeah.
Can you please just describe what do you mean by cyber war? Like,
that's exactly what I wanted to ask. Is there any definition which we can use?
I think there are several definitions, but I think I'm not gonna, because they're legal definitions, so I don't know off the top of my head, but I can send them to you afterwards. But I think the idea would be that the same principle as in traditional war would apply. Right. So, and I know that's always like a challenging area. Like if you think about all the big, at least internationally, all the big wars the last 10 years or so, I feel like almost none of them actually have been handled as wars. If I look at the US, I think they're just some conflict. Because in the US, in theory, it has to go through like Congress and they need to approve and they declare war, right? I think that's not happened for anything in the last 10 years. And I'm like, there have been big wars, right? But they're kind of police interventions. And I think,
How should we know that's a cyber war?
I think you'd know, because I think there will be countries attacking each other. But I think it is like one of the political concepts, right? And I think there will probably be discussions in the UN, right? It will be a lot like traditional war. I think that's what's going to happen. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Democracy in the international institutions, I'm not sure they're going to deliver any definition anytime soon.
Well, they're discussing it. There's the UN government, UN governmental expert, GGE, sorry, I hate. Yeah, there you go. Group of governmental experts. And they are actually discussing definitions like that, right? And so hopefully they will actually come up with some. We hope. Yeah?
Sorry, can I just help you quickly with cyber war?
Sure.
You're right that the definition doesn't really exist yet on paper. It's not official. It's rather a term which is used journalistically. But basically, since it has been acknowledged that international law applies to cyberspace, now we are in the process of redefining different terms, the way they apply in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. So the already known terms of use of force and armed attack, which exists in UN documents, are now being redefined for cyber. And the only more or less comprehensive attempt to do so, from my knowledge, is Tallinn Manual, which has been worked out by a group of international experts at the Center of Excellence, NATO Center of Excellence in Tallinn. So basically you can go there and look through this manual of how international law can be applied in terms of cyber warfare. So actually in that book, this term is used. And to my knowledge, this is the only more or less official source where you can read about, where you can get those descriptions and definitions of cyber weapons, cyber use of force and armed attack and cyber.
I think there's more than one. So, Tallinn is also being reviewed now, and it's also, I think, a very particular set of documents that look at the NATO environment more than anything else. I think the other things that you could think about is there's quite a lot of discussions going on in both the European Union and in sort of the concept of export control, sort of the Wassenaar Agreement stuff, where it's not necessarily just about the war, but it's a question of weapons and the definitions of weapons in cyberspace, which is also very difficult because a lot of technologies can be used for a lot of different things, even if it's the same technology. So they're sort of figuring out how do you deal with the concept of dual use, a technology that you can use for this will be a dumb example, but like technology that you can use for penetration testing, so for defensive purposes to see how secure a particular system is, can also be used to actually penetrate the system, so to attack, right? So how do you manage this where pretty much everything can do both things? So those are all sort of discussions that are going on at this stage. This has some additional, it doesn't have Tallinn on it because Tallinn is very cyber war focused versus sort of norms. But it has sort of groups on the slide that have been discussing the concept of cyber norms in recent times, and sort of are discussing it now. You have a combination of public-private forums, which are things where it's more almost think tank type environments that have been driving discussions and bringing together civil society, private sector, and governments to a greater or lesser extent. You have the East-West Institute that's been doing a lot of great work in this space, in particular looking at issues around supply chain, and how do you protect supply chain from basically government interference, and how do you demonstrate that actually has happened? The Munich Security Conference, which is a sort of a large gathering of particularly sort of defense space, but it has also sort of taken a cyber angle to in the last maybe 5 years. And the London process, which is a process which was started by UK government in London, hence the London process, but sort of moved around the world, which was in Seoul for instance, as well, it was in the Netherlands, and brings together like the foreign ministers plus the private sector plus civil society to have this discussion. But the main discussions have actually been happening in sort of the government space, largely away from the private sector or the civil society. The GGE is one such example. It's in this summer just sort of came together again. I think they had a meeting last week in Geneva, where they also started to discuss and try to make more concrete their sort of norms proposal with this new establishment of 15 countries talking to each other. You have stuff that's been going on in the OSCE, so the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that is much more focused on capacity building and confidence building measures. So trying to bring countries together to actually and start to talk to each other what each other are doing in cybersecurity space and helping each other in terms of, how do you set up a CERT that is functional? So, but also sort of trying to build trust between the different groups. The NATO sort of Tallinn is the main one, but also there has been several rounds of discussions between the NATO members of what would happen if one was cyber attacked. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has seen a proposal for sort of codes of conduct driven by Russia and China, and the members there, which also has several sort of sensible proposals that have been put forward. And G7 has been discussing sort of very concrete, smaller niches of cybersecurity. I think the most recently they've been talking about financial sector cybersecurity, because sort of in the aftermath of the SWIFT hack and sort of how exposed suddenly, I think everybody realized how exposed the global financial system can be and how dependent we all are on it. I think if sort of something really bad happened to SWIFT, no matter where you are, no matter which country you're in, the economic consequences would be tremendous. So it was one of the norms or one of the agreements that was most easily achieved. And I think it's something that will probably be replicated in other fora, just because all governments were like, yes, this is a problem for me too. And then there was then there is a level of bilateral agreements. So we've seen 2 years ago now, I think, China and the US had an agreement about cybercrime where they were like, oh, maybe we can stop. I think Germany and China had a similar agreement. The results of it are, I think, debatable. There is some research out there that shows that after the agreement, the level of Chinese hacking in China and in the US have gone down significantly. There's others who dispute this and are like, well, it just changed form, right? It just means they're probably just there and you haven't noticed yet. So I think we'll see like in the long term how this comes, but I think it does sort of I think norms is one of those spaces where you're like baby steps, right? And sort of, if it helps a little, it's a great progress, but it's a slow progress and it takes time. And then, so Microsoft put forward like a framework for evaluating behavior in cyberspace, which in particular doesn't necessarily go to sort of clear definitions of that we're talking about earlier in terms of war or what's bad behavior, but it looked at basically said, and for everything that happens in cyberspace, you should basically look at who the actors are, what their objectives are, and what their actions are, and what the impact is. And if any of this is something that is really objectionable and really shouldn't be done, you should be like, this is bad. It shouldn't be done. So if the objective is, I want to like bring this, like I want to attack someone and bring it down, that's a sign that like it doesn't matter like who the actor is or what the actual action is or what the impact is. The actual impact is a bad idea. So we put norms in 3 buckets. Our norms discussions in 3 buckets that sort of follow this framework. We put up there offensive norms, which would be norms that aim to sort of reduce the possibility of a conflict escalating in cyberspace. And I will give a few examples on the next slide. Then there are defensive norms, which are more about how do you make sure that the risk is reduced by actually putting defensive activity in place, whether it's through information sharing, whether it's through incident response. And then you have industry norms, where we felt it was really important that it's particularly industries that operate around the globe actually commit to a set of behaviors that would make sense in terms of protecting their users basically everywhere. I think this does, like I said, doesn't apply to necessarily everybody, but for instance, like a Microsoft or an HP or something like that, I think it would apply to. I think these are for us, we're companies who really want to secure products. We would never work with the government on actually attacking someone. There's companies out there who do it, right? There's companies who are like, who basically are like an arms company in cyberspace. We can't really afford to do that because we are a global company. We expect we will have, while we have a lot of users in the US, and the US is like where we're based, we have a lot of users abroad. We expect that numbers will grow. As you saw that like the map at the beginning, it will grow like a lot of in Asia. And they need to be comfortable that, when we discover a vulnerability, we actually patch it for everybody. And that that the government cannot come, the US government cannot come to us, but I think most likely the US one, cannot come to us and be like, can you just like not patch for Russia or, China or whatever. We need to be able to say, we'll patch for everybody. That was one example, but I'll give more examples. So that was the last one, actually. The industries should patch customers. So I'll maybe start from the bottom because I started there. I think the other thing was the importance of supporting response efforts. If something happens in cyberspace, I think it's important that governments actually make sure and help support the defense and response efforts in a particular organizations to recover. If they have information that would help, they should probably share it. Similarly, ICT companies should do the same. I think we see this sort of not emerge necessarily as a norm, but we're seeing it popping up in more and more laws around the world, in particular when it comes to sort of critical infrastructures, where both governments committing to sort of help their national champions or the national critical infrastructure if something happens, but also obligating the industry to do so. And we sort of see that as a positive step forward. Then there's one that is sort of just for states, the concept of preventing mass events. We sort of realized that cyber offensive will happen, but we sort of hope that governments will demonstrate restraint and really think about it before they engage in this space, rather than just press enter. The other one was sort of mitigate I messed that one up. The other one was to mitigate the impact of nation-state attacks. That's the wrong text up there. But the idea is to also make sure that that states don't necessarily attack things like certs, right? They're a little bit like hospitals for the internet, in our view. They're like, they shouldn't be attacked because they fix it. And they run operations that support the everyday running, that support and protect customers in particular countries, with information that sort of oftentimes are central to bringing together the industry and the civil society. And again, the global ICT companies should proactively participate in this effort. The other one that I touched upon really earlier was the stopping the proliferation of vulnerabilities. I think it's clear from research and to a level from countries publicly acknowledging this, countries are very active in the basically black market for cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Where if you look at like maybe 5 years back, the relationship with security researchers and ICT companies was a lot of time would be like, oh, you find a vulnerability, we'll put you in a newsletter and everything. And then they were happy with that because they were like, they would receive recognition in their like field. We now basically, I think the vast majority of big companies now pay for it. We have our own sort of bug bounty program. Other companies do too. Increasingly, other companies outside ICT sector do too. Because I think the other thing I know I've been talking about ICT companies, but the other thing to be thinking about is not just the IoT space where I was talking before, but the the big companies today all write their own software. So to give an example, Goldman Sachs has about 3,000 software engineers employed, which is more than Facebook, and has more lines of code that they've written that Windows has, right? And no one thinks about them as a software company. Everyone's like, they're a big bank. Potentially they're a big global evil force. But I think no one thinks about it in terms of, they actually need to have a lot of the same structures in place, like a Microsoft or like an HP. So they are now also putting out like bug bounties and things like that. But it's very hard for us to actually compete in this market because, and I'm not sure we want to compete in this market, if governments are really willing to pay for vulnerabilities a lot of money. And they do. And I think after the Heartbleed vulnerability, which was, I guess, 2014, the Obama administration came out with a policy, basically, that talks about how, partly because everybody was like, it's very weird how this happened, and you're not acknowledging your involvement, but they came out and they basically said, so this is how we handle the process. This is I think it's like a set of 5 questions, which are along the lines of like, is this a unique vulnerability? How many people will it expose? Is it important for national security? So they actually now have a public policy in terms of, okay, we might tell about certain vulnerabilities that we have to the vendors. Well, we might have some others still for ourselves for national security purposes. And so we were like, oh, all countries should do that. I mean, all countries should maybe not buy them, but we know that you do, so please have a process in place at least. And sort of the accompanying norm for the vendors is you should have a process in place where governments or researchers or anyone else who finds a vulnerability actually can talk to you and knows what happens and knows how the vulnerability is getting fixed. What we refer to at Microsoft as coordinated vulnerability process. And then the first one, it's sort of connected, it's really important to maintain trust in the online environment. I think from a economic perspective overall, sort of not just dependent on sort of the ICT sector, but given how persuasive the online world is in every aspect of today's life, we think it's very important that customers, users, people, whatever, are able to trust that if they do stuff online, it's sort of secure, it's sort of protected. So for that one, the sort of our probably main point for governments is like, can you not insert vulnerabilities like backdoors into the products and services of IT companies, so that we can actually collectively maintain trust. And the other one, the industry one, is you should not permit or let governments do it. So those are sort of, I think, the 7 ones that we have. I'm going to talk next about why, really quickly, about sort of what the different roles in this space are of particular multi-stakeholder dialogue and organizations, so civil society and industry. But I wanted to again stop and see whether people have questions.
Thank you very much, Kaya. I think I'll start with the question, and then probably some of you will also join me asking questions. As I heard, the major risk from World Economic Forum in Davos, the major risk was cybersecurity. It was like the top highest rated risk among all. But during this year, we actually didn't see actually so major events with this cybersecurity breaching or some. Like the most important, probably, if you go out and ask people in the street, they usually probably care if you ask about the threat, the war, probably in Middle East or I don't know, some other regional conflicts and so on. What do you think? Is it like hidden threat, and is it like not available for public, or it's just overrated in terms of risks?
So no, I think it's a combination of things. I think we've seen a lot. Like I think like the Yahoo breach in particular was massive. I think it was really reported in the U.S. In the U.S. also, everybody was very, very, very upset and paranoid about the Democratic Party breach. But it's also, I think it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination of, if you talk to normal people, and that's actually an essential problem of personal online safety conversations. If you talk to people on the street, unless something happens to them, they don't really care about security. Like, unless they're in the profession, they're like, nothing will happen to me. I'm not that important. Or I don't have any information to hide. They only really start taking more secure decisions online when something has happened. And I think that's a combination of sort of they don't know necessarily that something has happened, but also there is so much reporting, and at least I think, and maybe not here, but at least like the sort of, I read a lot of sort of German, Slovenian media in particular. There's like a story that's like terrifying every day. I think Germany had, actually it was maybe 2 weeks ago, Deutsche Telekom was attacked and was down for 5 hours. Then there was in the US, was a massive panic where a lot of the internet on the East Coast went down for like 4 hours because DIN was attacked. And sort of a lot of services were down as a result. So the services that relied on DIN, whether it was Netflix or Twitter went down for a while, but they're not like critical structures. They were more convenience things, right, that go down. I think, but I also think there's a level of reporting, because I think, and that goes back to, I think, your question of definitions. I think I think definitions are hard, but it also means that at the moment, because there are no established definitions out in the public vernacular, there is like everything is like an enormous cyber attack, and everything is like almost cyber war. And people, I think individuals are at the level where they're like, I don't know, how does this apply to me? Does it really, can I do anything? And on the other hand, we see in enterprises, we actually see a lot more enterprises starting to pay attention to cybersecurity. I think that's something where, like 5 years ago, if you had a conversation on cybersecurity at a conference, everybody would be like, oh, this is boring. But now everyone's like, oh, this is really important. I should listen. So we are seeing more and more companies investing in it. But it's also a lot of times it's still a struggle. It's expensive. And in all honesty, security is one of those things where you can be more secure, but you will never be totally secure, right? So it's a question of, so companies need to go through this complicated process of identifying their priorities, identifying where the highest risks are, like where they could be the greatest targets, and then being like, okay, I will invest here, and I will secure this area. In this area, maybe I'll get insurance, right? And hopefully nothing will happen, but in case something happens, I'll have insurance. In this area, maybe I will use the cloud, and maybe that's a little better. I'm not sure, but maybe, right? So I think there's a lot of conversations going on like this at the moment. To give an example of Microsoft in reality really started investing in security in about 2004, 2005, just before we launched Vista. We had like a terrible reputation for cybersecurity. And before Vista, they literally stopped all engineering and Gates delayed the product for, I think, about a year almost, to just make sure that actually all it went through security by design, that everybody was trained on security, all the engineers, everything. And now it's kind of an established practice. And you can, in reality, while still not perfect, you can see the products have really improved from a security perspective. And now under Satya, since Satya came on board like 2 years ago, there's both Satya's personal investment in this area. We announced maybe last year, we spend about $1 billion every year on security, but which again is like an enormous number, right? But which most people cannot do. But it also means that he actually has a monthly meeting with all the different heads of departments of all of the Microsoft operations. So like the cloud group, the Windows group, Bing, the Xbox, and sort of has a meeting with their security leadership. And they sort of go through the main issues every month for like 2 hours and sort of look at where we made improvements. And then also our board gets now briefed like every quarter on security. And that has actually been challenging. And that's also, I think, the bit that's challenging for other companies. Our board is a lot of technology people, but it's hard to explain, right? Even for people they're business people at the same time, right? And sort of if you go way too deep into sort of the weeds of like, we fixed this bug, and they're like, why am I spending this money? But there's been I think there's been a lot of more socialization and improvement. And I think we see other companies do that, but it's like a slow process.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
I agree. Any questions, please? I have actually many questions. Okay. So another question is, you're saying that this regulation and these cybersecurity issues put innovation at risk, right? But actually, cybersecurity technologies could, push innovations forward, like some ICT technologies, some, even infrastructure for this. It requires more, computer power or whatever. So could it be just an issue, a challenge that would prioritize different direction of technologies than just probably the other direction without those issues.
I think it's a combination. When it was on the slide, I think, and I didn't explain it, I'm sorry, but it was it was meant more in terms of like when states act that way, it does actually drive more investments in security, but sometimes that sometimes does put innovation at risk, and sometimes it doesn't. And also the other bit was the bit where I was referencing before, where you have, and that's actually concerning from a security perspective, when you have different governments putting different laws together, which are not necessarily always security focused. I'll give incident reporting as an example. Incident reporting is one of the features that sort of is very prevalent in laws, like whether it's in the EU or in China or Singapore, I think is going to put one forward, where the requirement is for companies to report cyber incidents to the affected party, but also to the government, and on a particular deadline. And I think the government, there was obviously clearly a good motivation behind it. But because it's not coordinated, I think for us, but also in particular for banks, people who operate across borders, they're like, I need to do one for Switzerland, I need to do one for Germany, I need to send everybody, they need to send 10 countries a report on this incident, and everyone wants it to have in a slightly different format. And if you talk to technology people, I think it gets they're like, I actually would love to share this information, because I think it's important, and we have established information sharing groups where I want to help my customers, but I also want to help others in the industry to learn from it. But because it's now a very strict law with very strict deadlines, which are slightly different everywhere, it turns into a compliance process that's not security focused. So a lot of the stuff becomes very, at least for us, it gets a lawyer looks at it. Right? Before anything gets sent to a regulator, a lawyer would look at it. And as a result, they take out as much as possible. So they take out actually a lot of useful information, because they're like, oh, but we could get sued. And so figuring out that balance, I think it will be challenging. The other reason why I said security can put into innovation at risk, I think it's always a balance, right? And I think if we look at examples, I think all countries have, because it's hard. Security actually takes time. And for instance, you need to have multi-factor authentication, right? So for me to log on the corporate network, it needs to recognize me. I have to have a password, but also calls my phone, right? So it's actually hard to get on the corporate network. But a lot of governments have systems that are separated from the internet, right? And we've seen, and this is also challenging, because it means that for a lot of the work that they do, they need to go on a separate computer, and the computer's not connected to the internet. And it worked in some classified environments very well, but we recently seen the Singaporean government to be we'll do it for all government. And not just government, we'll do it for all public sector, which includes schools, which means that schools are now not connected to the internet, right? And so when you have situations like that, and I'm sure something terrible must have happened in Singapore. I have no idea what happened, but they must have had an incident, right? That's not public, but because otherwise they wouldn't react this way. But it does then mean that that when you're in school, you can't actually use the internet. It's a bit so it's always a balance, and you need to be careful to achieve an outcome that both helps you go forward and helps you be secure. And at the same time, like you said, I think security is a great opportunity. I think if you find that good balance, you can actually drive really important innovations that people will use, because hopefully they will be more aware of security going forward. That would be amazing.
Okay. Yes, please.
Have you made in your company any study measuring comparatively vulnerabilities in various industries?
No, We haven't. We looked at like the vulnerabilities in our products, so that's why I can be like, oh, we've much improved, right? So from Windows, from like XP, the drop, like there was like a massive drop, but there's other companies who do it. There's in particularly security vendors that sort of sell protection do a lot of it. I think Kaspersky does a lot of it, and I think the last few years, sort of, there's always been kind of like there's government, there's healthcare, and banking, and I think they're starting to see a lot of energy also sort of prop up. Healthcare has apparently started dropping down the list in the last 2 years because there have been so many attacks. There's a lot of healthcare information available. So I think that's the other thing to sort of actually look at. They look at sort of the price of data. And healthcare always used to be super, super expensive because most people, especially if you have like healthcare personal information for like young people, like children, you'd often for years people wouldn't realize that someone is like using their data or using their account. So it was very valuable. But now because it was sort of, I think the numbers are something like credit card data is like $3 and healthcare data used to be like $13, $14. But so it's obviously all still very cheap, but just to give an example. But I think that started dropping because it's just the market's flooded. There's been so many breaches, and sort of across the world, right? Whether you look at Japan had like a pension hack, so they stole a lot of pension-related information. The US, I think the alleged Chinese hack of sort of government structures where they basically took information of all the classified employees that had all the records and sort of all their associates, all the social security numbers. So it's kind of like it's kind of everywhere. But yeah, I would actually look at some of the Kaspersky research, and Palo Alto actually also has a lot of, I think, data in this space.
At our institute we do foresight, and my question is about future studies. Such company as yours should do foresight for sure, I think. Can you share some vision of developing Microsoft on the horizon for 20 or 30 years?
I actually don't know. I think we do it, but I'm not sure we do it. I think the one company that really does it well is Shell. I think Shell is an excellent example, and I think they actually put it online as well. It's an excellent example of sort of the research they do in this space. On cybersecurity, the thing that's actually very interesting to look at is, for foresight, is Berkeley. I think it's Berkman Center. And they did like cybersecurity scenarios, and they did sort of 3 different ones of what could, maybe 4, what could potentially happen in the next 10 years. And they're just very fascinating read because it's sort of, it's something you don't necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis, but it sort of demonstrates of like, so what could potentially happen. So I would also recommend you looking at those. I don't really think we do them. I mean, maybe we do them, but I think, Masha, do you know we do anything like that? I don't think so.
May I continue this question? Is there any chance of appearing cyber states in the cyberspace? Because like language game in the cyberspace, it should maybe become the platform of appearing cyber states on the basis of maybe public and business partnership. Like Microsoft is an American country, but it is huge, large business.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I feel that all traditional states would be very against that. But, like there's initiatives like that. At the moment, a lot of them in the civil society, there's a lot of sort of cultural things where they establish a state in cyberspace and stuff like that. I think but in all honesty, I think when it comes to, to sort of the public and private. And I think you raise a good point. I think there's a weird dichotomy between, the businesses who've gone really global and the states who have traditionally, especially now, seem to be turning inwards. I think, you've seen in the last couple of months, whether you look at US or if you look at some of the European countries, the UK, there's a lot, or actually the EU with the Canada agreement, the trade agreement. I think there's a lot more focus on maybe we should just be ourselves and not be quite as enthusiastic about globalizations. So I think the next few years will be an interesting experiment in this. So I'm not totally optimistic about your idea.
Any more questions? I just want to ask one more question. I recently visited a forum and listened for Kaspersky himself, and he actually proposed that there could be a point of so-called absolute defense against cyber attacks when it was finance conference. So he said that if the damage, if the money stolen with this cyber attack would be less than the amount spent for the cyber attack, then in this case the defense is obsolete. And do you think this is possible to achieve such?
Yeah, but I think security is expensive. So I think I think that would be great. But I think it's one of those things where it's so hard. And in reality, the law, if you look at a lot of the attacks, they are very focused they're focused on the successful big attacks. They focus on individual. They're not really about technology, right? They're about how do I steal your password? Right, and how do I trick you into giving it to me without necessarily having any technological skill? Right, a lot of it is it's sort of still the same as it's been for 10 years, phishing attacks. I just got one yesterday. I got an email from PayPal, and PayPal was "Hi, you apparently paid this person this amount of money. Can you double check that this is you? Click here." And I was I didn't pay this money. And I think if I wasn't made aware and trained to pay attention to it, I would totally click on it and be no, I didn't pay this money. And I would give him my password because I would have to log into PayPal, right? So I think a lot of it is still that. So that's why I'm you can put a lot of protection in place, but ultimately it is humans at the center of it. And it's a little bit I'm going to give a terrible example, but it's like airplane crashes, right? Airplane crashes, 90% of the time is human error, right? I think security is technology is sort of evolving into that space, and that's not that expensive, right? You just need to trick someone. So. That's
interesting because I don't know, but if in terms of economic damage, I think if you steal passport from a person, probably it's not very expensive. But if some bad person want to steal money from the bank,
I'll give you a different example. So another phishing attacks on our systems. This was maybe a couple months back. And normally our system catch a lot of these things, but certain people in Seattle, not all of them, got an email that said, "There's been an earthquake. Please click here to say that you're okay." Microsoft security operations, so the physical security ones. And again, if I was here, I would totally click on it because I would be shit, something happened. Seattle has a lot of earthquakes. And the only reason why I didn't do it was because I was there and I was but nothing shook. I'm confused. There was no earthquake, right? And because we all have admin privilege, basically on the systems, if they got my password, they could actually go into there's some stuff they can go into, a lot of the cloud one is really secure, but some of the basic IT in the Microsoft systems, they could actually go and play with it and stuff like that. And that, and that's where it's kind of, you can actually get a lot very quickly. Another one example was where apparently a lot of our senior staff fell from it. This was maybe 3 years ago, just before Satya came on board. There was a lot of rumors, who's going to take over. And they targeted senior leadership, and they were like, this is the new CEO. And everyone opened that email, right? And you're like, but you're trained. Why did you do this? They got security credentials from a lot of our senior staff. And that's kind of the bit that I think it's terrifying.
Yeah, I don't want to finish at this point, so just...
I can go through that. I can be talk more about the PowerPoints, but we can also just stop.
No, just too terrifying point to stop. About something just very positive, probably. What do you think can actually increase cybersecurity, and what is the main obstacle or probably the main activity that should be undertaken to increase cybersecurity in the world, in Russia, probably?
So I think it's the same everywhere, and it's the same thing that's I think there's difference between what corporations do and what you can do in the general public or small businesses, which is the majority of people. And I think for the majority of people, I think there's probably 5 things that everybody can do that dramatically increases your risk of exposure. There's things like you should always patch your system, right? I think we find that 90% of the times when a Windows system is hacked, there's a patch available, right? The people just haven't patched it. There's things like use the most up-to-date systems. I'm not saying this to be, you should always buy the latest Windows, but I'm always terrified when I see people actually still using Windows XP, because I'm like, oh. But that was, again, looking back at the map, and I'm like, this was a very different world. It was really not designed for this world today, right? So I think that actually also really helps. I think it's things like, use passwords that are sort of complicated, but not complicated enough for you to forget it and have it on a piece of paper, and sort of try to switch it as much as possible. I think we'll see increasingly companies will start moving away from passwords. I think it's unhappy with me at the moment, but my computer sort of traditionally normally recognizes me and sort of just does facial recognition. But I think there's some things like that where you think about protecting yourself is important. Another thing I would say, which is bad because I've never done this before I actually started working in a company, is use software that's actually legal. We did a lot of the, I feel I'm a traditional Eastern European, and I was like, oh, this is too expensive for me to buy. But I think we did research on it a few years back where we tested pirated copies on Windows. And it's not that they're super, they're really well developed, but they also all had, I think 90% had malware on it, right? And infected the system and so they were able to actually get your credentials really quickly already from out of the box. The other thing I would actually, for in a small business environment, there's something the UK government pulled together, which is Cybersecurity Essentials, which is 20 control, I think it's 20. Maybe it's less. No, it's 5. Actually, no, it's 5 controls that companies can do that address. I think it's 80% of risks. So it's simple things companies can do, right? I think it's make sure that if you're a company, only certain people have access to the most sensitive information, right? Not everybody. Things like that, and that can make you a lot safer.
Yeah, indeed. So at least you know that several ways to increase cybersecurity, and I hope everybody else will follow your advices. Yeah. So, do you have any more questions, please? Then I'd like to thank our dear guest for presentation, for visit. Again, welcome you at High School of Economics anytime if you want to share with us any thoughts. And,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
And if anyone wants to have the PowerPoint, we can send it around.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine. Doesn't matter.